Nature performs miracles every day, but most of us refuse to believe in them until life forces us to. We scroll past stories of hope, survival, and destiny, thinking they are exaggerated or fictional. But sometimes, reality writes scripts that even the best storytellers cannot imagine. This is the story of a mother and daughter who were thrown out of their own home by someone they trusted the most, and what happened afterward was something no one could believe. Sadia was only 16 when her world turned upside down. Her father had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind a small house and a modest amount of savings. Her mother, Rukhsana, had always been a quiet woman, dependent on her husband's income. After his death, she tried her best to manage the household, but things were never the same. Bills piled up, relatives began interfering, and sympathy slowly turned into judgment. Among those relatives was Rukhsana's own stepmother, a woman who had always disliked her. After Sadia's grandfather died, the property disputes began. The stepmother claimed the house legally belonged to her and that Rukhsana had no right to stay there. At first, it sounded like an empty threat, but greed has a way of growing stronger when it sees weakness. One cold evening, everything changed. The stepmother arrived with 2 men and a lawyer. Papers were shown, voices were raised, accusations filled the air. Before Sadia could even understand what was happening, their belongings were thrown outside. The door that once welcomed them every night was slammed shut in their faces. Neighbors watched silently, some whispered, no one intervened. Sadia held her mother's hand as they stood on the street, their world reduced to 2 small bags of clothes. It was winter, and the sky looked darker than usual. Rukhsana's eyes were filled with tears, but she refused to cry in front of her daughter. She kept repeating, Allah has a plan. But even her voice trembled. They spent that night at a bus station. Sadia had never experienced such fear before. The cold wind felt sharper, and the stares of strangers felt heavier. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be homeless. The next morning, they decided to search for work. Rukhsana had basic stitching skills, and Sadia was good at studies. But survival was more urgent than education now. They knocked on doors. Some people listened politely and refused. Others didn't even open their gates. By the 3rd day, hunger became unbearable. Sadia tried to stay strong, but when she saw her mother pretending she wasn't hungry, something inside her broke. She walked to a nearby restaurant and asked if they needed help washing dishes. The manager looked at her for a moment and said she was too young. But destiny works in unexpected ways. An elderly woman sitting in the corner had been observing everything. She called Sadia over and gently asked about her situation. Sadia hesitated at first but then told her everything. The woman listened carefully, her eyes soft but thoughtful. Her name was Mrs. Rahman. She owned a small tailoring factory in the city. She asked to meet Rukhsana. When she heard about Rukhsana's stitching experience, she immediately offered her a job. Not out of pity, but because she believed in giving chances. That evening, for the first time in days, Sadia and her mother had a proper meal. Mrs. Rahman arranged a small room above the factory for them to stay temporarily. It wasn't luxurious, but it was safe. And sometimes, safety is the greatest blessing. Weeks turned into months. Rukhsana worked tirelessly, proving her dedication. Sadia resumed her studies through a local government school nearby. Every night, she would study under a dim bulb, promising herself she would never let circumstances define her future. But the real miracle had yet to unfold. One afternoon, a big clothing brand visited Mrs. Rahman's factory to outsource designs. They were looking for fresh, unique embroidery patterns. Sadia, who had always loved drawing, had filled an old notebook with creative designs during her free time. Mrs. Rahman noticed the notebook one day. She was amazed by Sadia's natural talent. Without telling her, she showed some of the designs to the visiting representatives. They were impressed. Within weeks, Sadia's designs were selected for a seasonal collection. The brand paid generously for each approved pattern. For a 16-year-old girl who had once slept at a bus station, it felt unreal. Money started flowing in, not millions, but enough to change their situation completely. Sadia insisted that the first thing they do was rent a proper house. When they stepped into their new 2-room apartment, Rukhsana finally cried, not from pain, but from gratitude. News travels fast in families. The same relatives who had watched silently now started calling. The stepmother, who had thrown them out, suddenly sent messages asking for forgiveness. She claimed she had been misled by advisors and regretted her actions. Sadia looked at her mother and asked what they should do. Rukhsana surprised her with her answer. We forgive, but we don't forget lessons. They chose peace over revenge. But life had one more surprise. Months later, a legal notice arrived. It turned out the documents used to evict them had irregularities. One of the witnesses had confessed to false testimony. The case reopened in court. This time, with financial stability and support from Mrs. Rahman, Rukhsana hired a proper lawyer. The judgment came after several hearings. The house that they were thrown out of legally belonged to Rukhsana. When the court announced the decision, Sadia felt a strange calm. It wasn't about winning property. It was about justice proving that patience is powerful. They decided not to move back. Instead, they sold the house and invested the money into expanding Mrs. Rahman's factory, making Rukhsana a partner. What began as a job became a business opportunity. Years later, Sadia became a recognized fashion designer. Her brand focused on empowering underprivileged women by teaching them stitching and embroidery skills. She often shared her story publicly, not to gain sympathy, but to inspire. When interviewers asked her about miracles, she would smile and say, "Miracles are not magic. They are hidden in patience, hard work, and faith." The stepmother eventually faced her own struggles. The same greed that pushed her to take everything left her isolated. When she fell ill, it was Rukhsana who visited her in the hospital. Because sometimes, the greatest miracle is not success, it is the ability to stay kind after suffering. This story reminds us that being thrown out of a house does not mean being thrown out of destiny. When doors close violently, windows open quietly. When people abandon you, strangers may lift you higher than relatives ever could. Nature's miracles do exist, but they don't always appear as lightning in the sky. Sometimes, they come disguised as a stranger in a restaurant, a hidden talent in an old notebook, or a mother's unwavering faith on a freezing night. If you ever feel like life has pushed you onto the street with nothing left, remember this: losing everything can sometimes be the beginning of gaining what truly belongs to you. And maybe, just maybe, the next miracle is waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it. The court's decision should have felt like the end of a painful chapter, but in truth, it was only the beginning of a new test. When the judge declared that the house legally belonged to Rukhsana, the courtroom fell silent. Sadia felt her heart pounding, not out of excitement, but from the weight of everything they had endured to reach that moment. Justice had spoken. The very walls that had once witnessed their humiliation now stood as proof that truth does not stay buried forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters approached them. Word had spread about the case: a widow and her daughter unlawfully evicted, only to fight back and win. Cameras flashed, microphones extended forward. How does it feel to win? One reporter asked. Sadia looked at her mother before answering. It doesn't feel like winning, she said calmly. It feels like closure. But closure is rarely simple. The stepmother, once proud and unapproachable, now stood alone near the gate. Her confident posture had disappeared. Regret was visible in her tired eyes. For a brief second, Sadia remembered that cold night when their belongings were thrown outside. The pain resurfaced like a wound reopening. Yet her mother walked toward the woman slowly. "I forgive you," Rukhsana said softly, "but I hope you understand what you took from us was not just a house." The stepmother lowered her gaze. She had no defense left. That evening, Sadia and her mother returned to their apartment, not the old house. They had already decided they wouldn't move back. That place carried memories of betrayal. Instead, they chose to sell it and invest in something that would grow, something that could not be stolen again. Mrs. Rahman supported their decision wholeheartedly. The factory had expanded rapidly over the past year, but demand was increasing. With the money from the property sale, they upgraded machinery, hired more women in need, and created training programs for widows and young girls. For Sadia, the factory became more than a workplace. It became a symbol. She started spending evenings mentoring new workers, teaching them design basics. Many of the women had stories similar to hers: abandoned, financially unstable, ignored by society. Each story strengthened her resolve. But success brings new challenges. A large corporate textile company noticed the rapid growth of their factory. At first, they approached politely, offering partnership deals. But when Mrs. Rahman refused to sell majority control, subtle pressure began. Orders were suddenly cancelled. Suppliers delayed deliveries. Competitors spread rumors questioning their quality. Sadia realized something important. Poverty tests patience, but success tests courage. There were nights when she felt overwhelmed. What if they lost everything again? What if the business collapsed? Fear whispered constantly. One night, while reviewing accounts, she found discrepancies in raw material costs. Someone was overcharging them deliberately. Instead of reacting emotionally, Sadia began investigating quietly. She spoke to suppliers directly, compared market rates, and uncovered a network of manipulation connected to the rival company. Rather than confronting them publicly, she chose strategy. She reached out to smaller local suppliers and negotiated fair contracts. She built relationships instead of transactions. Slowly, stability returned. Meanwhile, her designs gained attention internationally. A fashion blogger featured one of her collections online, praising its traditional embroidery fused with modern cuts. Orders began arriving from overseas clients. For the first time, Sadia traveled abroad to attend a fashion exhibition. Standing in a grand hall filled with designers from around the world, she remembered the bus station floor where she once tried to sleep through freezing winds. Life truly moves in circles no one can predict. During the exhibition, she met investors who were interested in ethical fashion, brands that empower women and ensure fair wages. Her story touched them deeply. Contracts were signed, partnerships formed. Back home, the factory transformed into a registered company under Sadia's name, with Rukhsana and Mrs. Rahman as equal partners. But destiny wasn't done testing them. One evening, news arrived that the stepmother had suffered a stroke. She was hospitalized, alone. The relatives who once supported her had disappeared. Rukhsana didn't hesitate. She visited the hospital immediately, with Sadia beside her. Seeing the once dominant woman lying weak on a hospital bed felt surreal. Her voice was faint, her arrogance gone. I was wrong, she whispered. Greed blinded me. Sadia felt a mixture of emotions, anger, pity, relief. But she also understood something deeper. Holding on to resentment would only chain her to the past. They arranged proper treatment for her. Not out of obligation, but out of humanity. Weeks later, when the stepmother recovered partially, she requested something unexpected. She asked Sadia to manage her remaining small property fairly and donate a portion to charity for widows. Perhaps guilt had awakened something within her. Time moved forward steadily. 3 years later, Sadia's brand became nationally recognized. She launched scholarship programs for girls who wanted to study fashion design but couldn't afford tuition. Every scholarship carried a simple message: no door closed by humans can shut what God has written for you. During an award ceremony honoring young entrepreneurs, Sadia stood on stage holding a trophy. Flashing lights surrounded her, applause filled the hall. But instead of talking about profit or expansion, she told the audience about hunger, humiliation, and hope. I learned that miracles don't fall from the sky, she said. They grow from pain. When you refuse to give up, even the worst betrayal becomes a stepping stone. The audience stood in ovation. After the ceremony, a teenage girl approached her with tears in her eyes. My father threw us out last month, she said quietly. I thought life was over. Sadia placed a hand on her shoulder. It's not over, she replied. It's beginning. Back at home that night, Sadia sat with her mother on the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Rukhsana looked peaceful, something Sadia hadn't seen for years before. Do you ever regret forgiving her? Sadia asked gently. Rukhsana smiled. Forgiveness freed us. Hatred would have kept us homeless inside. Those words stayed with Sadia. As years passed, the factory turned into a foundation supporting hundreds of women. Many of them eventually started their own businesses. The ripple effect was undeniable. One day, Sadia revisited the old neighborhood where their house once stood. New tenants lived there now. She didn't feel pain anymore, only gratitude. If they had never been thrown out, she might never have discovered her strength. She might never have met Mrs. Rahman. She might never have unlocked her talent. Sometimes what feels like destruction is actually redirection. Nature's miracles rarely announce themselves loudly. They hide in suffering, waiting for resilience to uncover them. The mother and daughter who once stood helpless on a cold street now stood as symbols of perseverance. Their journey proved that being rejected by your own blood does not mean you are abandoned by destiny. And perhaps the greatest twist of all was this: the stepmother, once driven by greed, eventually became one of the foundation's donors, quietly funding housing for homeless women. Her transformation was slow, but real. Pain had changed everyone. Sadia often tells young girls, when someone pushes you out, don't waste energy pushing back. Build something so strong that one day, they will knock on your door. Life had come full circle. From eviction to empowerment, from betrayal to business, from despair to dignity, their story became living proof that miracles are not about sudden magic. They are about surviving the storm long enough to see the rainbow. And in the end, the cold night that once felt like the worst moment of their lives became the reason they found their true purpose. Because sometimes, losing a home is how you discover where you truly belong.